in the Civil War, the angel of the battlefield. But that's only part of my story. By the time of my death in 1912, my life's work would touch millions of people worldwide, and it continues to do so. I was born into and lived in Victorian America, where a woman's place was limited to her home. Women did not have many legal rights and did not have careers. During my lifetime, I had several careers, any one of which would have been the life's work for any one man. Any one of my careers may have given a man fame and perhaps fortune as well. I had no care for riches, but fame was essential to my accomplishments. I was somewhat of a radical believer in women's suffrage, in human rights, in dress reform, and many other non-traditional and unpopular progressive cases. It was part of my genius and success that in the traditional Victorian world, I did not repudiate the traditional role of women. I used it. I did not rebel. I knew how to advance the causes I cared deeply about by not rebelling, but by convincing society to support them and celebrate them. Many could learn from my methods even today. In the public world dominated by men, I spoke and was listened to. I demonstrated beyond a doubt that my talent, courage, and intellect were equal to any man's. I never did a man's work for less than a man's pay. When necessary, I would state firmly to any man who questioned me, as for my being a woman, you will get used to that. Almost always they did. I liked men, I knew how to handle them, they accepted me, and they aided me in my non-conventional roles. I was extraordinarily successful in my self-appointed tasks. My contributions were unique. For the most part, I worked alone, and I liked it that way. I earned and enjoyed the fame and glory that was showered on me, and I used my fame, and I needed it. I needed it to support and further my work. My life's work was all important and continues and will continue to touch millions of lives. If you have ever received the care of a trained female nurse, if you have ever given or received a blood donation, if you have ever participated in or donated to relief efforts to help people who have been brutalized by natural disasters or war, if you have participated in a first aid course, or if you have a first aid kit in your home, car, or office, if your community has an ambulance corps in your town, then my life's work has touched your life. My life's work made America a safer, healthier place, and this is my story. I was born on Christmas Day in 1821 on a farm in North Oxford, Massachusetts. My parents were older, and I was a surprise. I was the youngest of 5 children, and there was a 10-year age gap between myself and the youngest of the others. My childhood was unusual. I was timid, insecure, and introspective. I loved being with my father. He told me fine stories, and from him I learned about military history and politics. My mother was an abolitionist herself and a believer in women's suffrage. She was a hard worker, stern and strong, quick-tempered and sharp-tongued, and she had a violent temper and a bent for profanity. She was compulsive, never slept after 3 o'clock in the morning, and always did 2 days' work in one. She had little time for me. My siblings, being older, became my protectors, my caregivers, my teachers. I had a strong connection and special relationships with all of my siblings. Dolly, my oldest sister, was an intellectual girl. She was a teacher, and she taught me to read. She suffered a breakdown in her 20s and could become violent. She was confined to the house, sometimes locked in to prevent harm to herself and others until her early death in 1846. In one frightening incident, she escaped the house and chased my brother David's wife, Julia, through the yard with an axe until David was able to stop her. My brother Stephen taught me arithmetic. He was a businessman. David taught me practical skills, caring for animals, how to ride hell-bent for leather on anything with four legs, with a saddle or without. This ability would serve me well throughout my life and throughout the Civil War. Sally was a teacher who helped Dolly teach me to read, and she would help me with my war work while she was living in Washington during the war. I related better to adults than children. I was a precocious prodigy of a child, but oh so very shy outside my family. In my old age, when I was considered one of the most courageous women alive, I would remember being afraid of everything as a child. When I was 3 years old, I was sent to school with my brother Stephen, who carried me a mile through snowdrifts on his shoulders. I was the baby of the school, but I knew much more than many of the others. My vocabulary was astonishing, and although considered the teacher's pet, not willing or able to mix well with other children, I was very, very quiet. But my advanced reading abilities were recognized along with my accomplishments in writing, arithmetic, and geography. My crippling shyness hindered my ability to make friends. When I was 10, my brother David fell from the high rafters at a barn raising. In agony, physical and mental, his case grew desperate. David had been my idol from earliest memory. I was distressed beyond measure. And in his wretchedness, he clung to me, and his illness, which just went on and on. I became his nurse for the next 2 years. At his side, my little hands became schooled in handling the great and loathsome crawling leeches which the doctors prescribed. My little hands dressed the angry blisters from the cupping the doctors insisted on doing constantly. David lived and was finally cured. I rejoiced in his cure, but I had a void in my life. In the 2 years I nursed David, I had not grown an inch. I had been to school only half a day, and I had gained only a pound. Although now free of my nursing duties, rejoicing my brother was well, I was adrift, I was deflated. I became more bashful, more timid, more sensitive than ever in the presence of others. I was always a hard worker, but my introspection and shyness began to worry my parents. My mother considered me a troubled child. My parents consulted Dr. Fowler, the famous phrenologist. My mother was anxious. How could she help me? Doctor said, throw responsibility at her. She has all the qualities of a teacher. When I was 18, I embarked on my first teaching assignment, District Number 9. My first day, I wore a dark green dress that I had made for my first day of teaching. I found in my little school 40 pupils that day, and I began what I thought would be my life's work. I was a gifted teacher who was keenly aware of my students as individuals. Towns begged me to bring some discipline to their troubled schools. I never found them all that troubled. Only one time I had to break out my riding whip and trip a boy and use it when he refused to stop disrupting the class and the education of others. Many of my students were my boys whom I would meet again in the great battlefields of the Civil War. At one school, my 70 students, ages 4 through 24, American and immigrant born, received an education in reading, writing, arithmetic, algebra, bookkeeping, philosophy, chemistry, and ancient and natural history. My first school won the district's highest marks for discipline. I thought this the greatest injustice, for there had been no discipline. I taught school in many a dilapidated building. I crusaded to aid my distressed and underprivileged students, and sometimes worked without wages in poor areas. I taught in the roughest district schools and demanded equal pay to a man's, and I received it. I told one school board that tried to pay me a lesser wage, I may sometimes be willing to teach for nothing, but if paid at all, I shall never do a man's work for less than a man's pay. And I received the equal pay I demanded and I deserved. I saved my money with the goal of expanding my education, and after 10 years of successful teaching, I wanted to find a school for myself. At 29, I took my savings and enrolled in the Clinton Liberal Institute in Clinton, New York. With my mother's death in 1851 and with many financial difficulties, I left Clinton with my education incomplete and an uncertain career and future. I still believed my life's work was education. With the death of my mother in 1851, I was overwhelmed by feelings of helplessness and depression. I accepted the invitation of Mary and Charles Norton, who had been students with me at Clinton, to stay a while at their family farm in New Jersey. In Bordentown, New Jersey, I noticed so many idle boys on every street corner, little knots of them, dirty, listless, idle. The number of boys in the streets made me uneasy. I had been teaching in private subscription schools in New Jersey, as there were no free public schools in that state. I refused to take this, and I agitated with the local school board. They claimed the boys were more fit for prison than the schoolroom. That free school was charity and insulting, and they told me a strong male teacher could not handle this, and I was a woman. Despite this, I convinced them to create a free school. I was given a ramshackle one-room schoolhouse. On the first day of school, only 6 boys appeared. As always, I was relaxed with my students. I encouraged them and I engaged them. I answered their questions and told them stories. The next day, there were 20 boys in the classroom. In 2 weeks, there were 55, and young girls began to come with them to school as well, until there was a waiting list of over 400 children. The town fathers were so impressed with this success that they voted to spend $4,000 to build a new, much larger brick building to accommodate 600 students. Enrollment grew to 603 students under my leadership. When new schoolhouse number 1 opened in the fall of 1853, I was stunned to learn the town fathers decided that a school so large and so successful would not be run by a woman. Instead of hiring me to be the headmaster, the school board hired a man, J. Kirby Burnham, and paid him $500, twice as much as they were paying me. I was demoted to be his female assistant with disastrous results. The school began to descend into disarray. Mr. Burnham, despite being a man, was not the strong, competent administrator that I was. In February, with my health thoroughly impaired and my body weak from stress, I was unable to speak at all. I resigned. Burnham was dismissed at the end of the school year, and the finger pointing and strife in the town doomed the free school experiment. After leaving New Jersey, I made a fateful decision. I went to Washington, D.C. in search of new employment. I would never teach for a living again. I settled in a boarding house. I called upon my distant cousin, Massachusetts Congressman Alexander DeWitt, for advice. He opened doors for me in both the social and political world. I was introduced to Judge Charles Mason, Patent Office Commissioner. He was impressed with me. He offered me a job of full-time recording clerk in the U.S. Patent Office in July 1854 at $1,400 a year, an amazing salary for any man and exceptional for a woman. But the Patent Office was a man's world. Judge Mason was willing to hire women because he believed I was a good clerk. His boss, Robert McClellan, Secretary of the Interior, was of a very different opinion. He pressured Mason to dismiss female workers, and my position was always at risk. Mr. McClellan deemed it most improper for men and women to work side by side. Judge Mason protected my job as best he could. I was more efficient than any of the men I worked with. I knew it, and so did they. When the judge took up the war against corruption in the patent office, I worked with him. I became even more unpopular with my male coworkers. I developed a fearless nose for sniffing out the rotten eggs in our basket. But the men returned my righteousness with catcalls and spitting of tobacco juice on my hem, blowing cigar smoke in my face, and making up rumors about my lack of virtue. I believed I had every right to employment in this masculine world. I believed that the bad treatment, the dirty looks, the bad language would not dislodge me as long as Judge Mason ran the office. My right to work was honored. When Judge Mason left for a few months, McClellan immediately demoted me to copyist, earning 10 cents per every 100 words I copied. I worked even harder, only to earn $900 a year this way, a big pay cut. And that's only if I was given work to do. I lost my job when the Buchanan administration was inaugurated, but I was reinstated in 1860 with the Lincoln administration. Civil War came to us on April 12, 1861, with the firing on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. On April 15th, Lincoln put out a call for 75,000 volunteer troops to come to Washington. The capital was a southern city below the Mason-Dixon line and needed protection. 4 days later, on April 19th, en route to defend the nation's capital, the 6th Massachusetts Infantry was attacked by mobs of Southern sympathizers while changing trains in Baltimore, Maryland. The Baltimore rioters killed 3 soldiers and injured almost 40, making troops from Massachusetts, my state, the first casualties of war. The government was not at all prepared to deal with soldiers, wounded or otherwise. They had no barracks or army hospitals, so the Massachusetts boys ended up in the Senate chamber of the Capitol. I went there with my landlady and my sister and brought the boys supplies from our own households. These boys, my boys, had almost nothing. No beds, no changes of clothes, not enough rations. If the Union was this ill-equipped now before the fighting had even started, what would happen out in the battlefield? I began collecting supplies for the men. Overwhelming my response to requests for supplies for the troops marked the start of my career as the angel of the battlefield. The boys in blue always came above everything for me, my cherished and brave boys in blue, so many so recently out of the schoolroom. These boys were now sacrificing all for the Union cause. With the outbreak of the war after Sumter, I was keenly aware of how profoundly unprepared we were. Soldiers starved and died for lack of the most basic necessities. I determined I would do something about that. I became a wartime supply organizer and relief worker. At first, I worked for the soldiers of my state, Massachusetts. They wrote home to their families about me, and I wrote to anxious families of men in Massachusetts, and other ladies' groups and generous New Englanders inundated me with supplies and stores for our boys. My home became a warehouse. Then in July, I watched horrified as soldiers staggered back to Washington. Not one ambulance or wagon was available to bring the wounded from the Bull Run battlefield. This was during what was called the Great Skedaddle, the first Bull Run defeat. It was a national tragedy and a national scandal. Some of the wounded lay out in the field for days before anyone found them. Those that got back had to wait for any medical attention. Men were literally starving. I helped horribly wounded men who'd been sick with fever with no one tending them. I wanted to do more. I was disturbed by numerous accounts of terrible suffering at the front. Soldiers with wounds unnecessarily complicated were dying for neglect and lack of basic supplies and food. Nurses were urgently needed on the battlefield. I was never a prude, but it was unseemly for a woman to place herself directly among men, directly in the line of battle. I was torn. I was uncertain, and while wrestling with such thoughts and feeling, word came that my beloved father, 87 years old, was dying in Massachusetts. So I went home to Massachusetts to nurse him in his final illness. The war had placed a grim task ahead of me, one I wrestled with and agonized over. I was frantic over my beloved father's failing health. I spoke with him from my heart, and on his deathbed, he gave me his complete support for my path forward. He had been a soldier, and I was the daughter of a soldier. I confided to my father my misgivings about undertaking a dangerous mission to the battlefields and what society would say of me. My father reassured me. He gave me confidence to follow my conscience. He told me, I know soldiers and they will respect you and your errand. He gave me his Masonic emblem, and I wore that throughout the war, assured that any who belonged to that brotherhood would furnish me with assistance and with protection. On the day of my beloved father's funeral, I received a letter giving me official permission to go to the sick and the wounded on the battlefields or wherever they were to distribute supplies and nurse them, with the only authority over me being the surgeon in charge. The letter was signed by none other than Dr. William A. Hammond, Surgeon General of the United States. With this precious official permission, I broke the shackles and I went into the field. Upon my return to Washington, I was not welcomed by Army officials despite my past from the Surgeon General. The Army initially refused my assistance and my donation of supplies, believing I would be more of a hindrance than a helper on the field. I continued to fight the beliefs of society which frowned upon an unmarried woman straying from the home, and certainly any woman who would be alone among men. Despite this, I was able to convince powerful men that I would be a valuable asset to men suffering on the front lines. In August 1862, Quartermaster Rucker, along with Senator Wilson, supported me. Rucker gave me official permission to transport supplies to the battlefields with Army wagons. Because of the faith of these two powerful men, I was able to take supplies into the field. Because of my drive, organizational skills, and efficiency, I had a huge impact on the field hospitals with my supplies. I loved those boys in blue and was respected and loved by them. I considered myself one of them. On August 2nd, 1862, I had my first encounter with a field hospital in Fredericksburg, Virginia. I was appalled by the chaos of untrained ambulances, the lack of clean bandages and fresh water, and the terrible delay that always accompanied the arrival of government-issued supplies. The Battle of Cedar Mountain was fought on August 9th, 1862. I reached the battlefield with my precious freights transported in railroad cars and heavy jolting army wagons. This was the first battle I served on the field. When I arrived, it was a scene of utter chaos, desolation, and confusion. I was totally unprepared for the carnage. 3,000 wounded men were lying in a sparsely wooded field on straw with no other bedding. Most had not eaten all day. Many faced amputations or other surgeries. My typical battlefield clothing was a dark blouse and a calico skirt, which I immediately pinned up and began moving among the wounded. I distributed coffee, crackers, and other supplies I had brought. We all prayed that the combination of lighted candles and dry straw would not result in a fire that would engulf us all. The doctors were entirely out of dressings of every kind, and I supplied them with everything I had. I was calm and collected. I comforted the countless wounded and dying men. I spent 2 days and nights tending the men before leaving. I provided assistance for Confederate wounded as well as our own boys in blue. Dr. James L. Dunn wrote to his wife, At the time, we were entirely out of dressings of every kind. She supplied us with everything, and while the shells were bursting in every direction, she stayed dealing out shirts, preparing soup, and seeing it prepared in all hospitals. I thought that night, if heaven ever sent out a homely angel, she must be the one. Dr. Dunn's letter was published nationally during the war. I did not take kindly to the word homely at all. I took control of my legacy and I corrected the letter at every publication, rewriting the word homely into holy. My biographers and many historians since took their cue from me, and I became not the homely angel of the battlefield, but the holy angel of the battlefield. Chantilly followed quickly upon Second Bull Run. At Chantilly, Dr. Dunn wrote, "We had nothing but our instruments, not even a bottle of wine. When the railroad cars whistled up to the station, the first person on the platform was Miss Barton again to supply us with every article that could be thought of. She stayed there until the last wounded soldier was placed on the cars. I worked 5 days in pouring rain, thunder, and lightning vied with the volleys of the cannon. Army wagons kept arriving, bringing more dead and more wounded. I kept working. As always, I took time to jot down the names of many wounded men so their families could be informed. I allowed myself to sleep 2 hours. My tent floor was a swirling stream of water. I woke to wring out my hair and my skirt and return to work. Mud was knee deep, and several of the boys I nursed had been my former pupils. As I bent down over one pale boy with a mangled arm, to my surprise, he threw his good arm around me and started sobbing. 'Do you not know me?' he sobbed. 'I am Charlie Hamilton, who used to carry your satchel home from school.' The wounded were being evacuated to the trains, and I realized none had eaten for more than 24 hours. I insisted all the wounded be brought to the train at a certain checkpoint so they could be fed. Many I fed with my own hands. Suddenly, an officer galloped up to me with the news that General Kearney had been killed and the Union was in retreat with enemy in full pursuit. 'Miss Barton, can you ride?' 'Yes, sir.' 'Do you have no lady's saddle? Could you ride mine?' 'Yes, sir, I can ride without it or with it.' Unbeknownst to the officer, I could ride any animal hell for leather, thanks to my brother David. 'Then you can risk another hour,' he shouted and galloped off. He returned at 4 at breakneck speed. 'Now is your time, Miss Barton. The enemy is breaking over the hills. Try to get to the train. It will go through unless they have flanked and cut the bridge a mile above us. In that case, I have a reserve horse for you, and you must take your chances to escape across country.' In a matter of minutes, I was on the train, and so were every one of my patients. The conductor took a torch and set fire to the station. As the train pulled away, I could see the station ablaze and rebel cavalry galloping down the hill. 2 weeks later, I rushed to Antietam and arrived at the height of the battle with all my supplies. At 1 a.m. before the battle began, I got my teamsters up and moving, and we caught up with the artillery. I knew to follow the guns was the quickest way to supply relief. As the fury of the battle began over Antietam, I directed my wagons to where the firing was the thickest, where we would be needed the most. At Poffenberger House, there were wounded laying all around. All supplies were gone. The wounded were being bandaged with corn husks. Dr. Dunn was there again with Dr. Craddock. He was speechless seeing me. 'How did you get from Virginia so soon? We have not a bandage or rag or lint or string at all. The shell wounded are bleeding to death.' I supplied the hospital with precious medical supplies. Hundreds of wounded surrounded the farmhouse. Under fire and the roar of the cannon, I nursed and fed the wounded. A man lying on the ground asked me for a drink, and I raised his head up with my right hand to give it to him. At that moment, a bullet sped between myself and him, tearing a hole in my sleeve. The man I was holding was dead. I never mended that hole in my dress, and I kept it the rest of my life. Although lacking medical training, at the insistence of a young wounded soldier, I extracted my first bullet from his cheek using my pocket knife. I found another young wounded boy who didn't look like a soldier and refused to have his wound in the breast dressed. After gentle probing, I ascertained that the soldier's name was Mary Galloway. I shepherded her and shielded the girl and located her lover in a hospital in Washington. The two named their first daughter for me. I cut an eccentric figure with the hem of my skirt pinned up about my waist, my hair in disarray and my face covered with gunpowder, but no one laughed at the sight of me. I had the habit of both command and comfort. I didn't flinch if I had to hold a leg that was to be amputated. I did not cry at the ghastly death of some former pupil. After working virtually nonstop, supplies and strength gone, following the conflict, I was laid down on the floor of an old wagon by my teamsters. I arrived back in Washington dazed with a violent fever. My face was still the color of gunpowder, a deep blue, and I was critically ill with typhoid fever. The Battle of Fredericksburg, I was working at the Lacey House on the hill across the river overlooking the town. Hundreds of men were crowded into 12 rooms. A pile of arms, legs, and feet graced the door of the mansion. As always, I tried to record the names of the wounded. Over the years, faces from this house would come back to me. A man saved by a tourniquet, repeating as he clutched my skirt, "You saved my life." More than one poor man fatally shot believed I was his dear wife or sweetheart or mother. The Lacey House would become for me all that was needless suffering and collected misery during the war. A courier rushed up the steps of the house and put a crumpled and bloody paper into my hand. It was from Dr. Clarence Cutter, medical director of the 9th Army Corps. He had set up a hospital across the river, and the note pleaded, "Come to me, your place is here." I was urged not to go, but I crossed the river on one of the rope bridges, swaying and rocking as gunshot and shell exploded around us on the opposite shore. A Union officer stepped to my side to assist me off of the bridge. An exploding shell flew between us, taking away a portion of the officer's coat and part of my dress. A half hour later, that same officer was brought to me dead. In town, the dead were lying everywhere. Every church, school, public building, and many houses and yards were filled with dead horses and human wreckage. Many lay in the snow without help for several days, and the snow and ice had to be hacked from them with axes. I did all I could. I worked on and on, living in a tent beside my wagon. Finally, when my supplies ran out, the wounded died or were sent to Washington. I too made my way back. I climbed the stairs to my boarding house room, cheerless, confused, and alone, and sank down upon the floor and wept. In the summer of 1863, I was not at the Great Battle of Gettysburg. I had joined my brother David, a Union quartermaster in South Carolina. I was at the second attack on Fort Wagner on July 18, 1863, and I witnessed the remarkable courage and sacrifice of the gallant 54th Massachusetts, a black regiment from my state that led the assault on the beaches outside of Fort Wagner. After the failed assault, I nursed the wounded black and white alike, and the bravery and sacrifice of these men was forever fixed in my mind. For the rest of my life, I was rigidly committed to human rights and equal rights for all, black, white, women, poor, and all those unable to defend themselves. That summer, I worked alongside Frances Gage, one of the most influential and important people in my life. She was my mentor and friend for 20 years. Here in South Carolina, I also met the great love of my life, John Elwell. The hours we spent together were like golden threads woven into the web of my life, there to shine forever and ever. John was the only one who ever came near to my exacting standards for a husband. He was married, though, and there was no question he would return to his wife when our golden time was over. We would remain friends for the rest of our lives. For a week before the assault, I watched from on board the Fulton as Fort Wagner was bombarded. Hot charges sent sands of geysers up and about, battering the fort. Finally, believing that Wagner was deserted, the Federal troops made a night assault. In strict regimental formation, our men struggled through the sand, a perfect target for the rebels. I shudder to think of that awful charge. I could hear the sickening thud of case and canister slushing through the bodies of the men. I watched as our troops leapt from boats like wildcats into a wild charge across the marsh, up the banks, and into the entrenchments. I saw beloved Elwell gallop madly toward the fort to rally the men and then fall from his horse badly wounded. He was one of 1,500, nearly a third of the charging forces killed or wounded in the battle. Somehow I got off the ship and to the shore in the midst of the fury of battle. I struggled to wade through the pitted and blowing sand. I reached Elwell and bathed his face until he regained consciousness. Like so many, he crawled on his hands and knees down the beach, his wounds filling with sand. The surgeons were too hurried to spend time with anyone not critically wounded, and I reached them and gave them hope. Many claimed I gave them strength to recover. The colonel of the 10th Connecticut awoke to find me bathing his temples and remembered me as an angel. The world diminished into a horrifying existence of hungry and ill men in shock, gaping abdominal wounds, newly amputated wounds, and starvation. By May 1864, terrible slaughter of the wilderness in Spotsylvania turned all pitying hearts once more to Fredericksburg. Here I witnessed some of the most frightening scenes I ever encountered. 50,000 men were killed or wounded in the wilderness campaign. As battle-hardened as I was, I saw many things I did not wish to see, and pray God I may never see again. Rain turned the red clay soil of Virginia into deep mud, and hundreds of army wagons crowded full of pitiful wounded and suffering men were stuck in the tremendous traffic jams and mass confusion. I immediately set about feeding the men in stalled wagons. I managed to procure a quantity of crackers and a huge kettle of coffee. When faced with the fact that there was no way to get to the wounded, I waded into the waist-high mud toward the stalled wagons. In town, the wounded were starving in the streets. Some heartless, unfaithful officers decided it was a hardship to the refined Southern citizens of Fredericksburg to be compelled to open their homes as hospitals for the dirty, lousy, common soldiers in blue. Always a champion of Army Blue against Gold Braid, I hurried back to Washington to advise my dear friend Henry Wilson of this. Wilson, the powerful chairman of the Senate Military Affairs Committee, quickly notified the War Department, and one day later, the homes of Fredericksburg were opened to shelter Union soldiers. I returned to Fredericksburg with additional supplies and continued my work with the wounded. When I rose from the work, I wrung the blood from the bottom of my clothing before I could step for the weight about my feet. One of the greatest tragedy of the Civil War was that tens of thousands of soldiers died unknown, and tens of thousands of families were left without consoling knowledge of their loved ones' fates, circumstances of death, or place of burial. At least half the Civil War dead were never identified. There were over 190,000 unmarked graves. The U.S. Army had no mechanism in place to notify the families of the death of a soldier. At the end of the war, I made it my mission to find and locate as many unknown dead as I could identify, so loved ones at home could have some solace about the fate of their beloved. With official permission from President Lincoln, I established the Office of Correspondence with Friends of the Missing Men of the United States in Washington, D.C., or Clara Barton's missing soldiers office, and worked for 4 years to bring information to more than 22,000 families about their loved one's fate. I devised a plan to identify missing soldiers by publishing in newspaper monthly rolls of men whose families or friends had made inquiries. Any person with information could write to me and I would forward it to those concerned. Families from around the country sent me letters asking for help in finding missing loved ones. Over 63,000 letters were processed by my office. As I went about my work, I learned not everyone was willing to be found. Soldiers who became attached to Southern sweethearts, soldiers who had deserted, or simply wished to start a new life, preferred to remain missing. One young man, Joseph Hitchens, demanded to know what he had done to have his name blazoned all over the country in newspapers. I answered, "What you have done, I certainly do not know. It seems to have been the misfortune of your family to think more of you than you did of them, and probably more than you deserve from the manner which you treat them. I shall inform them of your existence, lest you should not see fit to do so yourself. Signed, Miss Barton." Andersonville was the worst of the infamous Southern prisoner of war camps. It held more prisoners at any given time than any of the other Confederate military prisons. During the 14 months it existed, more than 45,000 Union soldiers were confined there. Of these, almost 13,000 died from disease, poor sanitation, malnutrition, overcrowding, or exposure to the elements. So many were laid in unmarked graves. On June 22, 1865, a young man and former prisoner of Andersonville, Dorrance Atwater, wrote me a letter introducing himself and asking for a copy of my missing soldier lists. He suggested that he could provide information on many of those listed. While imprisoned at Andersonville, he had been sent to work in the office of the Confederate surgeon, J.H. White, as a clerk. His task? Keep the daily records of deaths of all federal prisoners of war. The horrors he witnessed at Andersonville led him to begin keeping a secret copy of his register in August 1864, a list that he safely brought with him to Union lines in March 1865. I went to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and asked that I be given access to the Atwater lists, which were in the possession of the Army and being copied. Granting my request for access, the Secretary of War invited me and Dorrance Atwater to accompany an expedition to Andersonville. Dorrance Atwater and I assisted in identifying many of those buried in what became Andersonville National Cemetery. Over 13,000 men were identified and their graves marked. Only 400 remained unknown. Captain Moore led the expedition and he was odious. Because of a schedule mix-up, I was late to board the USS Virginia at departure, and Captain Moore was furious and swore, saying, "God damn it to hell, and what in hell does she want to go for?" The spirit of his animosity polluted the trip. Conditions of the camp were horrifying. I walked the pitted, filthy prison ground, and for the first time, I lost my objectivity. Throughout my service during the war, I had treated all the wounded impartially to the utmost of my ability and resources. Now, bitterness moved me against the South. I would never again give the South the benefit of the doubt, and henceforth actively gave my support to the radical Republicans. My bitterness was heightened by the continuation of Captain Moore's animosity. He was clearly exasperated at the presence of a woman. He ignored me and he was jealous of me. In my mind, he became a bitter enemy and he remained so. But with aching hearts, we worked at our appointed task. Nearly 13,000 graves were properly marked. Only some 400 carried the words, "Unknown U.S. Soldier." I never lost sight of the fact that thousands of hearts mourned for these young men. It was an emotional and draining experience. My role in the cemetery's creation was officially recognized when I was chosen to raise the U.S. flag over the prison grounds. I advanced and ran the flag up amid the cheers of the beholders. Up, and there it drooped as if in grief and sadness, till at length the sunlight streamed out of its beautiful folds and filled. The men struck up the Star-Spangled Banner, and I covered my face, and I wept. The war exhausted me. I labored to the full measure of my strength. I labored without pay and often used my own funds to purchase supplies. I shared the conditions of the common soldier in the field. So many died in my arms. I refused a tent unless the army had tents also. I never ate a mouthful until the sick of the army were fed. I could work and be useful under the most dangerous conditions. I earned the respect of surgeons and generals who ordinarily did not want to deal with women. I treated all men in need alike, be they Union or Confederate, white or black. I earned forever the love of the men. I understood early on that I needed to publish the causes I believed in dramatically. I knew that this was crucial for receiving public support. I knew it was crucial in securing and controlling my reputation and legacy. In 1866, I began a brilliant lecture career that publicized both my causes and my name, garnering public acclaim and support for both. As a world-class lecturer after the war, I stood on the stage with the likes of famous American men, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Mark Twain, and Frederick Douglass. My talk centered on the work and incidents of Army life and the work at Andersonville. I always dressed beautifully in black silk. I made sure my hair was jet black and carefully groomed. My voice always sweet and clear. I detested lecturing, but it made me financially secure for the first time in my life. All speech making terrified me, and I hated it. It was always so very stressful for me. In 1868, while delivering a lecture in Boston, I suffered from a nervous breakdown and was ordered by my doctor to recuperate in Europe. I arrived in Great Britain in 1865 and then traveled to Switzerland, and I soon found my greatest cause. I was introduced to Dr. Louis Appia and learned of the International Red Cross. Dr. Appia asked me why the United States had not signed the Geneva Treaty, and I told him I did not know why, and I didn't know about the Red Cross at all. I found that several powerful American war workers, all men, had urged the United States to sign, but had failed, and the U.S. remained the only major nation, a nation that had come through a devastating civil war, that did not accept the Geneva Pact, that provided for neutral assistance to sufferers of the war and to wounded and sick soldiers, prisoners of war, and civilian non-combatants that aided them. The idea of an international Red Cross was born in 1859 when Henri Dunant, a Swiss businessman, was caught in Solferino, a village in northern Italy where forces of Emperor Napoleon III and Austria's Emperor Franz Joseph's forces met on the battlefield. 40,000 men were killed or wounded at the Battle of Solferino. Henri Dunant, the man in white, began relief services to provide water, food, and medical supplies for the wounded. He was haunted by the plight of simple soldiers who suffered without complaint and died humbly and quietly without water, bandages, medical supplies, food. Amid scenes of horror, he was inspired by the Italian peasant women who murmured, "Tutti fratelli," all men are brothers, while treating the hated Austrians and giving away the little they had. Henri Dunant wrote a book, The Souvenir of Solferino, advocating that all wounded, friend and foe alike, should be cared for. In February 1864, the Geneva Treaty was signed by 11 European nations. Inspired by Dunant's book, the treaty provided for national relief agencies in a time of war and the treaty rendered neutral and immune from injury in war all who cared for them. The enduring symbol adopted was the reversed Swiss flag, thereafter recognized as the Red Cross. On July 19, 1870, France declared war on Prussia. The Franco-Prussian War, I saw the work of the Red Cross firsthand, and I participated in it wearing the Red Cross badge I would wear for the rest of my life. I worked mostly with suffering civilian populations and received honors from European royalty on both sides of the conflict for my work. Despite being decorated by all of the warring European nations for my work, once my work was ended, my eyes gave out, my nerves collapsed. I never learned to care for myself, and the insomnia I suffered throughout my life became worse. In 1873, I sailed home to the United States, unsure of my future, but determined to regain my health and work for my causes: women's suffrage, how to promote the Geneva Convention, the ratification of the Geneva Treaty by the United States, and the establishment of an American Red Cross. I came home to the United States and began educating myself and the American public on the International Red Cross. I was determined to bring the Red Cross to the United States, determined that our government would ratify the treaty, determined to succeed where confident, well-connected men had all failed. I spent 5 years working hard. I used every political connection. I persuaded journalists and veterans about the value of the Red Cross. I published a pamphlet titled "What the Red Cross Is" to educate the American public. In a time when women weren't often change makers, especially in the halls of Washington, I campaigned tirelessly against the tide of naysayers. I worked with several presidential administrations, and after President Garfield was assassinated, President Chester A. Arthur assured me he was a supporter of the Red Cross and would confirm President Garfield's intention to forward the Red Cross Treaty to the Senate. On May 21, 1882, the Senate ratified the Geneva Convention. The United States became the 32nd member nation, the last major nation in the world to ratify the Geneva Convention. The American Red Cross was officially born. It was a colossal, glowing, monumental achievement, and it would influence American and international relief work forever. I had succeeded. I was 60 years old, and my new life's work had begun. The Red Cross and I would become one. I became president of the organization. The Red Cross was my child. I would be its driving force for the next 23 years. I participated in relief work all over our nation and the world. I was the first woman to represent the United States at an international event, the International Conference of the Geneva Convention. I spoke about what the Red Cross had accomplished in time of peace in America. Under my leadership, the Red Cross provided relief not only in times of war, but domestically responded to many natural disasters, floods, fires, famine, earthquakes. The conference was so impressed, it voted to include peacetime relief in the Red Cross and ratified the American Amendment in my honor. And the Red Cross relief in war and peace would become the worldwide hallmark of this institution. During the years I was president of the American Red Cross, we assisted at the sites of numerous natural disasters. From 1881 on, nearly every year the Red Cross was actively engaged in the relief of some calamity. Because of me, not only wartime relief, but assistance in all natural disasters and time of crisis became the work of the organization. I was honored and celebrated during my tenure as president of the American Red Cross. I traveled on relief missions to all the great disasters of the 19th century: famines, floods, fires, wars. My great and good friend, Dr. Julian Hubble, was the first and greatest Red Cross chief field agent. uncompromisingly loyal, skillfully organized, and quietly in control of so many of the relief efforts. The most celebrated peacetime undertaking of the young American Red Cross was at Johnstown, Pennsylvania in 1889. On Memorial Day, the Conemaugh River Dam broke and a huge tidal wave destroyed the town, killing 2,200 people and destroying millions of dollars in property. I arrived in Johnstown 5 days after the tragedy on the first train to get through. I lived and worked in a tent and remained for 5 months. We built a warehouse to store supplies, and the Red Cross, under my direction, not only supplied relief, but we supplied jobs and a spirit of self-help to the victims, along with material assistance. Once the warehouse was dismantled in Johnstown, I had the lumber shipped to Washington, D.C. for the construction of a new headquarters and storage building. Dr. Hubble supervised the construction in Glen Echo, Maryland. Construction followed the lines of the Johnstown structure with an added third-floor lantern room and the look of a steamboat. This building would become the national headquarters of the American Red Cross from 1897 to 1904. I was photographed in 1897, the year I moved to Glen Echo, and these are the pictures I saved and gave to people requesting photographs. In 1898, I traveled to Cuba with the Red Cross to aid civilian populations detained by the Spaniards. We distributed food and medical aid to hospitals, orphanages, prisoner camps, and American public sentiment was with us and the Cubans, who suffered terribly from Spanish oppression. 2 days before the USS Maine exploded on February 15, 1898, I dined aboard the ship with Captain Charles Sigsbee. On the evening of the explosion, we were nearby busy at our writing tables with much paperwork. It was late at night. The house was quiet when suddenly the table shook from under our hands. The great glass doors that opened onto the sea flew apart. Everything in the room was in motion or out of place. The deafening roar of such a burst of thunder that was louder than had ever been heard before. Over the bay, the air was filled with a blaze of light and black specks flying in all directions. Then came the news of the Maine. Our nation was at war again. I was distressed to find that once again the Army Medical Department had inadequate personnel, supplies, food, bandages, medicines. All were lacking. It was the Civil War all over again. No improvement in a third of a century. Our supplies were godsend. Barrels of gruel, malted milk, food given to soldiers sick and wounded who did not eat for days. Despite praise for our efforts, I encountered the same prejudices that hindered my work during the Civil War. Surgeons called on us for supplies, but none thought a woman nurse would be in place in a soldier's hospital. Women proved them wrong, just as we did during the Civil War. I pursued my work impartially. Cubans, Spaniards, Americans, civilians, and soldiers all received care. I tried to be everywhere I was needed. I was blessed and praised by my countrymen and the enemies of my country alike. With the conquest of Santiago, Cuba, the first vessel honored to enter the harbor was the Red Cross relief ship, the State of Texas. I stood proudly on the deck of the ship as it entered the harbor and led the Red Cross workers in singing America. I was the most decorated woman of my age. Even though the United States never formally recognized me with a medal, many other nations did. As I aged, I treasured them. I wore them to all my speaking engagements and to ceremonies. I would often wear them working in the yard or my garden or milking my cows. Those medals really brightened up an old dress. Despite my insistence that age didn't matter, that I could do it all, my methods were dated. In 1885, I was still the Red Cross's only full-time employee. I refused to delegate and did everything myself. I continued to go into the field to the Johnstown flood, to Cuba during the War of '98. I led a relief mission to Armenia. I went to the scene of catastrophe in Galveston. Many thought I was too old. Age was a subject I carefully avoided. I continued to dye my hair jet black. I made my home at the headquarters for the Red Cross in Glen Echo, Maryland, outside of DC. There would be no Red Cross without me. My enemies wanted me out and accused me of financial misfeasance. A Senate investigation found me innocent and all charges were dropped. Though completely exonerated from any wrongdoing, I felt this indignity for the first time in my life. I had had enough. I resigned from the presidency of the American Red Cross on May 14, 1904. I wasn't done with careers yet, though. After many decades of nursing, I was expert at applying first aid in an emergency, and I knew firsthand that first aid in an emergency could save lives. In 1905, I created the National First Aid Association and served as honorary president for 5 years. The organization emphasized basic first aid instruction, emergency preparedness, and developed first aid kits. Ambulance brigades were formed in conjunction with police and fire departments in many cities and towns in the United States. My work made America safer and healthier. By 1909, the first aid training would be incorporated as one of the essential functions of the American Red Cross. With the passage of time, my vision would prove true. First aid practiced in the home would help more people than the Red Cross ever could, and emergency preparedness would prove to be the most important element of disaster relief. In 1907, I wrote my last book, The Story of My Childhood. I was tired, I was aging, but I fought it. I kept my white hair dyed coal black, and I skillfully applied makeup. I missed my old friends and family, all who had passed before me. I was lonely and I was worried about how I would be remembered. I knew I was extraordinary. I knew I made a difference. I had always put service to others above myself. I needed my causes. I needed to work. I was prone all my life to dark periods of deep depression and apathy. I suffered. But when I stood day and night in the presence of hardship and physical suffering, I did not stop to think. There was no time for that. Ease pain, soothe sorrow, lessen suffering. That was my only thought day and night. Everything else I lost sight of, myself and the world. When working for a cause, I believed I was manic, almost superhuman in my efforts, and yet I was only mortal. By age 90 in 1912, I was worn out. I had double pneumonia twice that year and never fully recovered. 2 days before I died, I dreamed I was again on a great battlefield of the American Civil War, surrounded by wounded men. I gave them water. I heard them speak of mothers, wives, and sweethearts, with never a murmur or a complaint. I awoke abruptly because of a stupid pain in my back, that's all. Here on a good bed, I felt ashamed that I had murmured. 2 days later, on April 12th, 1912, I died. My last words were, "Let me go, let me go." My nephew laid me in my casket on the steps of the Glen Echo home, and then I was taken home to Massachusetts where I would be buried. When the wagon driver heard he was carrying my body, he dropped his reins and cried, "My God, is this the body of Clara Barton?" Then he explained his father had been a Confederate soldier shot in the neck at the Battle of Antietam. He was alone and bleeding to death, and then said to the driver, "Miss Barton found him on the battlefield and bound up his wounds in time to save his life." Others are writing my biography. Let it rest as they elect to make it. I have lived my life, well and ill, always less well than I wanted it to be. but it is as it is and as it has been. So small a thing to have had so much about it. Thank you.